Thank you very much for inviting me also onto this interesting panel, which is very close to issues in our heart. My name is Maria-Thalia Carras, and I'm representing Locus Athens, which then became Stavros. Locus Athens was, I'm just going to give you a little run through of some projects, but let me just introduce a little bit that Locus Athens was founded in 2004 as a platform for investigating the juncture of contemporary art in public space. And for many years, we produced, commissioned, researched the relationship between public space in Athens and contemporary art. And around 2018, we started thinking about what public space meant more in terms of communities rather than actually physical space. So we decided to actually create our own art space where we could use as a foray to think about inside and outside. We decided to create the space in an area called Stavros, which has a specific social and psychic geography, which is that it's an area which is kind of uncharted in terms of art in Athens. It is an area with a lot of social housing. It's an area which was formed by migrants in the 1920s, arriving from Asia Minor. So actually the name Stavros is a series of mountains between Turkey and Armenia, which is where all the migrants arrived in the 1920s. And the social housing was built for them in the 1950s. Because of the social housing, there is a great social cohesion. There's a lot of green urban space in between the buildings, which are used by people still a lot. Even though it's quite close to the center, people in the center of Athens don't seem to really know or understand what Stavros means. Also because of its social history, it's got a very strong Marxist and left-wing fighting spirit. So this is one of the reasons that we chose the area, was exactly that whilst choosing to move inside, we wanted to keep on looking outside and thinking about what public space meant and how that could be considered both in a discursive and in terms of education and thinking of communities and forming different communities, and in terms of celebration, because we think also that public space is a place which can be celebrated. Interestingly, our first project, given this is the Nordic Lab, our first project was started from the north. So we decided that sometimes talking about something which is far away is actually a good way to look at the pathogenies that we have at home. So we started our program with a screening, an exhibition, which was exactly thinking about what public space means. So taking a discursive approach to how we can think about public monuments. You may know of Jonas Dahlberg's project for Utoya, for the massacre in Utoya that happened in 2012, if I'm not mistaken, which talks about his approach to creating a public monument for all the youths that were murdered in the summer camp on the island of Utoya, and the failure of this public monument because of an outcry in the local area. So we wanted to talk exactly about the failures of public space in Greece through looking at a film. Here are some shots of the installation. So the film actually takes a narrative where it talks about what went wrong in the procedures of creating a public monument, which is how you include the local community, what it means to remember, what you decide to remember, what the public state decides to suggest as something worth remembering. And through this exhibition, we created several panels with invited participants from Greece who brought these subjects back home to Greece. So we had a first panel, which was thinking about mainly the psychology of remembering trauma and collective traumas, and how then that can be represented. So we had members from the Kurdish communities, refugees, people who work with communities, talking about how narratives are created and how then from these narratives one can move on to thinking about remembering in a public form. And then we had a very interesting panel thinking about the failure of public monuments in Greece. Thinking about major collective traumas in Greece, like the civil war, like even the arrival of the refugees from Asia Minor in the 1920s, and how in Greece there still isn't a monument, a public monument anywhere which sort of honors this collective trauma. If you imagine how many people had arrived in the 1920s in Greece from Asia Minor. And then, of course, this debate became ever more prescient because after the last few months of the debates of what monuments mean, both in America, both in Bristol with Colson's sculpture being thrown down. So how do we decide to remember? What do we decide to remember? How do we heal collective traumas? How do we talk about public space in that form? These were all issues that we started to discuss and which we feel are very pertinent. So even though we moved inside, we were thinking again about outside, and also even about our local area of Stavros. Now I'll walk you through a few more projects because we have an approach to public space which goes from I'd say the discursive to education, to thinking about communities, to research, and as I said, celebration. So I'll walk through some of these. Following on shortly after Jonas Dahlberg's program, we started a educational program, which is again thinking about communities in our local area. So as I said, our local area was formed from various layers of migration, starting from the 1920s, but also very much now. There's a huge community of migrants from the Punjab, from Morocco, who seem to provide quite a positive case study of migration, which seems to have worked in a cohesive way and sort of worked in Athens. So we decided one of the first things that we should do in terms of outreach in our local area was to move to a primary school, the second primary school, which has a very forward-looking and open-minded headmaster. So we started working also with a school and also after that with a municipality. And we offered every class in the primary school an 8-week program dedicated to thinking about craft and technology. This was the first time that something of this scale had ever happened in the school. So for us, again, it was a way of thinking about how you form communities. How do we create social networks in our local area? How do we reach out and think about and question these relationships? So I'll just walk you through some of the program was called Technotech, which is a play of words between technology and no technology. We were thinking about the use of digital the children have, and thinking about different crafts and using hands, science, all linked together. Here you have some images of the workshops. This is an architectural workshop, which is exactly thinking about the children's playground and how that could be rethought of as a school that flies. And here is that. So let me take you through the next project, which is this one, which is a collaboration with Creative Europe, thinking about sustainability through, we decided, bread. And we invited 3 different artists to think about what bread meant for them. And the first artist that we're working with is a young Greek artist called Paki Vresopoulou, who decided that she wanted again to create, to think of bread as communion, as companionship, literally. That's where the word company comes from, the idea of sharing bread. So she wanted to think of bread as a form of sharing, a form of coming together, but also in terms of the word and the printed press, since both the language and the agricultural revolution concurred at the same time. So she was thinking about creating a newspaper called Bread, which will be distributed in the area of Stavros, and will be translated in all the languages of all the communities that live in Stavros. So that will be Urdu, which is for the Punjab community, Arabic, Armenian, Albanian, Russian, of course, Greek. And then there is a big, because within the network of social housing, there's also new corporations that have set up. And there's a big French company called Teleperformance, which is another form of community that will also be translated in French. And these newspapers will be dispersed in all the different bakeries of Tavros to be picked up by the residents, the local residents. So the idea is that in the same way, thinking in relation to COVID and the biological, the way that that dispersal happens and how bread ferments and is spread, and the same way news and information is spread. So a metaphor is created between how communities are formed. The precursor for this thinking about bread and what it means, both in terms of politics and social cohesion and coming together and communities, was a workshop that happened last weekend, which was again thinking about the biological and fermentation. And there was a bread workshop. Unfortunately, because of COVID, it had to be in a closed circle of artists, bread workshop in parallel with a clay workshop. So the idea of, again, of clay molding and bread coming together. As you can see some images here of the bread and clay workshop. That's the bread, which was also delicious. On another level, we are thinking of public space as somewhere to be researched and archived. So here you have another part of our program, which is called Stories, which again relates to this idea that we think of a narrative, telling stories, oral histories, ways of, again, sharing knowledge, which creates another form of commons, another form of community, thinking about our local area and how we can correlate to it. So we're working with a filmmaker and photographer called Theodoros Krivanos, who has started archiving and taking down oral histories from the neighborhood of Tavros. This is a program that's just started, and he is interviewing and speaking with a variety of local inhabitants, looking at them through their, because there are a lot of workshops still in Tavros. It's an area where there are lots of car workshops, you know, the last glass blowing workshop, etc. So looking from a professional angle as an entry point, he then is taking down their stories, photographing and documenting the area. So creating a database of ways of looking and of learning from all these people who live in the area around us, from migrant stories to Greek stories to different generations, from people who live in the social housing opposite our space. Here are some of his photographs. Not exactly, you know, making a correlation between image, sound, moving image, and all this material will be archived and thought of as to how, which is the best way to then use it in relation to the inhabitants and the people who have, you know, taken part in this, in these stories. Here you see a very clear view of what Tavros is like, an area which is quite sleepy still and quiet. So the last program that I'll run you through is what I would say is a celebration of public space, because public space is also where we come together to, I think, to rejoice, to celebrate, it's where we leave our homes from in order to even make a political statement, if you like. But so we started a program recently, which we hope will run for a while, which is called Unfortunately It Was Paradise. It's related again to the area of Tavros, because it's about, it's a film program which looks at all the issues that are raised from Tavros. In other words, migration, labor rights, women's rights. And it's a film program which is related also to part of the audience that lives in Davros, which is a community of Arab inhabitants, both Moroccan, but also as it's an area where there are a lot of NGOs which work with Eleonas and other areas. So it's a film program which basically is supposed to offer a view back onto and be relevant to the people who live in the area. All the content is also in Arabic as well as in Greek as in English. And it started with screening a few weeks ago before everything started being closed down in a public space in a basketball court in Davros. The first screening was Cairo Station, a masterpiece from 1958 by Youssef Chahine, an Egyptian filmmaker. A film which touches on various issues that are still incredibly pertinent to the Arab world, but also to Greece. The idea of feminist rights, the idea of unions. It's a melodrama, but which through the melodrama, all sorts of topics arise. So the idea was that this screening happened in a public space in the center of a inhabited area. It's part of the social housing. And even as we were setting up the program, all the local inhabitants came down, started watching. There was a group of young boys with crisps in the front seat. So the idea of cinema and as a place where you can rejoice and share whilst thinking about very serious topics. There was, we also collaborated with children, with unaccompanied minors from Metadrasi, who also took part in the whole program. So again, creating another layer of sharing and creating communities. So let me just walk you through. Here you see, it was a cine concert. So we had musicians who were creating a live musical score for the film. So it really was like a real rejoicement, a celebration, celebratory moment. So again, thinking about the idea of how we can relate to the people in the area around us, so that it's not, so that our positioning in Davros is not a space which has its back turned, but is totally relevant. And this is the question that we're constantly positing to ourselves. How can we be relevant to the people and the communities around us? What can we say that makes sense to them? How can we speak to them in a language that can be understood? How can they speak to us in a language that we also understand? How can we create a cross-germination of knowledge? How can we be there, literally, to provide a place where they can also come together? So these are some of the issues that we are thinking of in Davros, whilst also thinking about the politics of the area, the idea of sustainability as through the bread program, and so on and so forth. I don't know how long I've spoken for.
I think you've just about used up your time. That's perfect. If you could just say a few words to finally sign off, that was really good.
You want me to? Okay. So basically, yes, our program is based now on thinking about communities, on thinking about sustainability, on thinking how we can always be relevant to people around us, and not just be an art space which is centered on its own self, but thinking always about the other in that sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.